In the winter of 1918, a country doctor named Silas Hartwell rode up into a hollow that had no name on any county map, following a boy who had walked 11 miles through the snow to fetch him. The influenza had come to the Ozarks that year, the way it had come everywhere, silent and total, emptying whole hollows of the old and the young in a single week. Hartwell expected to find another family shut up with the fever. What he found instead was an old man sitting upright in a cabin at the head of the drawer, wrapped in quilts, entirely alone and entirely lucid, who looked at the doctor and said that he had been waiting a long time for somebody to come and write it all down before the last of it went out of the world with him. The old man gave his name as Obadiah Crole, and over the next 4 days, as the snow closed the trail behind him and the fever never came, Dr. Hartwell filled the back pages of his account ledger with the strangest testimony he ever heard from any living person. We know this happened because the ledger survived. It passed through a granddaughter to a county historical society, and it sat in a box of donated papers for the better part of a century before anyone read the back pages closely. What is written there is not the raving of a fever patient. The hand is Hartwell's own, careful and trained, and in the margins he noted the times, the dates, the old man's pulse and colour, all of it steady and clear. Whatever Obadiah Crole was, he was not delirious. He simply knew things that a hill farmer born in the middle of the 19th century had no way of knowing, and he told them to the one educated man who ever bothered to climb up and listen. It helps to understand what kind of winter that was. The influenza had turned the Ozarks into a country of shut doors. Whole families lay in single rooms with the windows sealed against the cold and the sickness both, and a doctor who went from cabin to cabin carried death with him as often as he kept it away. Hartwell was one of only 2 physicians serving a spread of hill country larger than some eastern states, and he had not slept a full night in 3 weeks when the Crole boy came down out of the snow to find him. He went up expecting to lose the whole family and to bury them himself in frozen ground. He climbed for most of a day, the boy always ahead of him and never speaking, up drawers that pinched shut and opened again onto benches of land that no road had ever reached, until the light was failing and he began to think the boy was leading him nowhere. Then the cabin stood up out of the trees, older than any building he had seen in that country, its logs silver with age and its chimney drawing a thin straight line of smoke into the still air, and the boy pointed at the door and turned and walked back down the mountain and was not seen again. Hartwell wrote that he never learned the boy's name, and that when he asked Crole about him, the old man said only that the boy had done what he was sent to do. Crole would not give his age. When Hartwell pressed him, the old man only smiled and said he had stopped counting when counting stopped meaning anything, and that he had been a grown man already when the land looked very different from the way it looked now. There was no birth record for him in any county in Missouri. There was no marriage, no deed, no census line. He appeared in no ledger of any kind until the moment he appeared in Hartwell's, an old man in a cabin nobody had built and nobody remembered going up. The neighbours down the valley, when the doctor asked, said the Crole place had always been there, that their fathers had known it as an old place, that the man in it never seemed to change, and was best left alone. They said this the way people in that country said everything that frightened them, quietly, and with their eyes turned away. Later, when the doctor had come back down and tried in a careful way to learn what the valley knew, he found that the valley knew more than it would say. An old woman who kept bees on the next ridge told him, once she was sure he would not laugh, that her grandmother had spoken of the old people, the ones who were in the land before the settlers and before the tribes too, the tall ones who had gone into the hills and had never entirely left. She said you did not build on certain ground, and you did not dig in certain places, and if you turned up cut stone where no cut stone had any right to be, you covered it over and said nothing and moved your fence. She said the Crole place sat on such ground, the worst of it, and that her people had given it a wide berth for as long as anyone could remember, and that the man who lived there had lived there beyond all remembering, and was not counted among the living or the dead, but somewhere off to the side of both. Hartwell wrote all of this down too. in the same careful hand, and noted that the woman crossed herself when she finished, though she was no kind of Catholic. What Crole described first was the flood. Not a flood of water, he was careful to say, though water came into it near the end. He described a flood of earth. The world he had been born into, he said, had been buried slowly in some places and all at once in others under a tide of mud and clay that rose against the walls of the old cities and poured through their lower windows and set hard as stone. He said the buildings had not fallen. They had been drowned standing up, their first floors and their second floors packed solid, so that the men who came after walked in through what had once been the third story and called it the ground. Hartwell wrote that the old man tapped the floor of his own cabin as he said this, tapped it 3 times, and asked the doctor whether he had ever wondered why the fine old courthouses in the river towns had windows down at boot level, half sunk below the street, as if the street had risen up to swallow them. The doctor had wondered. Every man who ever walked a Missouri county seat had wondered, and had been told it was settling, or bad planning, or a raised road. Crole said it was none of those things. He said the mud had come, and the people who survived it had cleared out the top floors and moved back in, and forgotten within 3 generations that they were living in the attics of a drowned world. He spoke of the ones who built the old cities. Never once did he call them giants, though Hartwell, writing it down, could think of no other word. Crole called them the tall folk or the first tenants, and he described them without wonder, the way a man describes a landlord he never liked. They had been here first. The great mounds all through that country were their raising, the flat-topped hills that the settlers ploughed around, and the government men measured and shrugged at. They had cut the stone that lay under the soil in courses too straight to be nature, and they had gone into the caves, the endless caves that made Missouri a hollow land, and worked them, and left in them the marks of tools that no Ozark farmer ever owned. Missouri is a hollow land, and every hill man knew it. The whole of the state is undercut with caves, thousands of them, more than anyone has ever counted, rooms and rivers and galleries running for miles under the farms and the towns. The settlers used the shallow ones for cold storage and for hiding stills, and during the wars men had dug saltpeter out of the cave floors to make powder. But the deep caves, the ones that ran back past the reach of any lamp, those the old-timers left alone, and they told their children to leave them alone, and they never quite said why. Crole said why. He said the deep caves had been worked before any settler was born, that the tall folk had gone down into them and cut them and used them, and that the marks of it were still there for anyone with the nerve to crawl far enough back. Crole told the doctor to go and look in the deep caves if he did not believe it. He said there were rooms down there squared off true, and channels cut in the rock that carried no water and never had, and walls that had been dressed smooth by hands, far back where no torchlight from any settler had ever reached before the mud came and sealed the mouths of them. A man crawling back into one of those galleries, he said, would come to a place where the rough natural stone ended clean along a line, as if cut with a knife, and beyond it the walls stood flat and square and true, tooled all over with the small even strokes of a chisel that no farmer had ever owned or seen. He said there were steps down there, whole flights of them worn hollow in the middle by feet, leading down to doors that the mud had packed shut. And he said that in the deepest room he had ever seen, so far back that the air went strange and the lamp burned blue, there was a shaft cut straight down through the living rock, perfectly round, going down farther than a dropped stone would sound, and that warmth came up out of it, a steady warmth in the dead of winter from somewhere far below. He said the tall folk had drawn something out of the deep places, a warmth, a light that needed no fire, and that the caves and the mounds and the drowned buildings had all been part of one working, one great machine, of stone laid across the whole country, that gave heat in winter and light in the dark, and asked for no fuel and made no smoke. He said the shape of it mattered, that the old builders had laid their forts and their towns out in points like stars, angle answering angle, because the working drew its power from the shape as much as from the stone, and that a man could still find those pointed outlines in the oldest towns if he climbed a hill and looked down and knew what he was seeing. And then the mud came and the machine went quiet, and the men who dug their way out into the cold never learned how to wake it again. Here Hartwell wrote a line in the margin, in a smaller hand, as if to himself. He wrote that he had seen the great white palaces at the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904, when he was a young man, seen the domes and the colonnades rise up white as bone along the lagoons, and had been told they were made of plaster and lath and would be torn down when the fair closed. He wrote that he had never understood how men had thrown up an entire marble city in a season and then knocked it flat, and that he had asked Crole about it without meaning to. And the old man had laughed, the doctor wrote, laughed for the first and only time in 4 days, and said that they had not built those. They had uncovered them and dressed them up in plaster to hide what they were, and shown them to the crowds for a summer, and then buried them again before too many people started asking the right questions about who had really raised a white city on the Missouri bluffs, and how it had come to be sitting there under the sod, waiting to be found. Crole said that after the mud there was a great forgetting, and that the forgetting was not entirely an accident. He said that when a world ends, the children who come up after it have no memory of what stood before, and that this is natural. But he said that a thing had come through the hill country in his own middle years, a thing that wore the shape of men and travelled with wagons and papers and the authority of the government, and that it went from mound to mound and cave to cave collecting. It took the great bones out of the ground where the farmers turned them up, the thigh bones longer than a tall man's leg, the jaws that closed over a living man's whole face, the double rows of teeth that the county papers wrote about for a season and then never mentioned again, the tablets of cut stone with the lettering on them that no scholar would read aloud. It carried off as well. It took all of it away in the wagons, and it left behind a story, a comfortable story about simple mound builder tribes who piled up dirt for no clear reason and then conveniently vanished, and it made sure that story was the only one printed in the books the children learned from. Hartwell knew, as any reading man of that time knew, that the newspapers of the Ozarks and the whole Mississippi Valley had for 50 years carried notice after notice of enormous skeletons turned up in the mounds, measured by doctors and sheriffs and Sunday preachers, crated up and shipped east to one single institution in the capital for study, and never seen or spoken of again. He had read those notices himself and thought little of them. Sitting in that cabin with the snow against the window and the old man's steady voice going on, he began, he wrote, to think a great deal of them. He could call several to mind. A farmer near the river bottoms who ploughed into a mound and turned up a skull so large a grown man could set it over his own head like a helmet, and a thigh bone that stood as tall as the man's belt when he set it on end. A crew grading a rail cut who broke into a stone-lined chamber full of long bones laid out in rows, with copper on the wrists and slabs of cut mica over the faces. And before the county doctor could arrive to measure them, the men from the east were already there with their wagon, and the bones were crated and carried off, and the story died in a week. Hartwell had read a dozen such accounts across his life, and had shelved them all under the heading of country exaggeration, of ordinary graves seen by frightened men in bad light. The old man in the quilts described the same things, and described the wagons that came for them, and described who sent the wagons, and it was harder to shelve them after that. The mounds themselves were no secret, and never had been. They stood all through that country, in the bottoms and on the ridges, some of them low and broad, and some of them raised up in steps like the foundations of buildings that had lost their upper stories. The government had sent men to survey them and dig into them, and the men had written careful reports, and the reports said the mounds were the work of vanished tribes and left it there. Crole said the reports were not lies, exactly. They were the story that had been handed down to be told, the comfortable version, arranged so that a man would read it and nod and never once ask why a wandering people with no metal and no wheel had raised 10,000 hills of earth in perfect geometry across half a continent, and then walked away from all of them at once. Crole named the far country the old world had belonged to. He said the map still remembered it if a man knew where to look, on the old charts drawn before the great forgetting settled in, where a single vast name was written across the whole northern half of the world, a name the newer maps had quietly cut into pieces and handed out to smaller countries until it was gone. He said his own people, the tall folk and the ones who served them, had been the western edge of that country, its last shore, and that the mounds of Missouri and the drowned cities of the river bottoms were its ruins, the same as any ruin across the water. The empire had a name, and Hartwell wrote it in the ledger the way the old man said it, and the name was one that a hill farmer in Missouri in 1918 had no earthly reason to have ever heard. There is a version of all this that requires nothing strange at all, and it deserves to be said plainly. Folklorists who have studied the Ozarks, and there have been good ones, would recognize almost every piece of Crole's testimony. The tall ancestors, the drowned world, the buried cities, the forbidden knowledge in the caves, these are among the oldest stories human beings tell, and they turn up in isolated hill country everywhere on earth, carried in by settlers and worn smooth by retelling until they feel like local memory. The sunken courthouse windows have an ordinary answer, which is settling ground and raised streets, and the slow burial that comes to any building that stands long enough. In truth, the mound builders were real people, the ancestors of living nations, grander in their plain reality than any story of vanished giants. The great skeletons of the old newspapers were, in case after case that anyone bothered to check, either honest misreadings of ordinary bones, or the deliberate hoaxes of an age that loved a tall tale and sold papers by the column inch. And the white palaces of the St. Louis Fair were exactly what the guidebook said, plaster on wooden frames, beautiful and temporary and gone by the next spring. A dying man in an isolated cabin, steeped since childhood in the deep folklore of his people, might weave all of it into one seamless account and believe every word. That is the reasonable version, and it may well be the true one. But it leaves a few things sitting in the corner of the room. It does not explain why there is no record of Obadiah Crole anywhere on this earth before the day he began to speak. No birth, no name, no line in any book, as if he had walked up out of the ground the settlers were standing on. Nor does it explain how a man who could not read described maps he had never seen, and named an empire whose name was not taught in any American schoolroom of his century. It does not fully explain the wagons that the old newspapers themselves recorded rolling east full of crated bone toward one address from which nothing ever came back. And it does not explain the thing that Hartwell wrote on the last page, in the smallest hand of all, on the morning the snow finally broke. He wrote that Obadiah Crole had died in the night, quietly, sitting up with his eyes open toward the window and the first grey light on the snow. He wrote that when he went to close the old man's eyes, he found the body cold and long past stiffening, cold as if it had been dead for many hours, though Hartwell had heard him speaking clearly not 3 hours before. And he wrote that when the neighbours came up at last with the thaw to help bury him, and they dug the grave at the head of the hollow where the old man had asked to lie, the spade struck stone a little more than a foot down. Not field stone, cut stone, dressed smooth and laid in courses, running off level in every direction under the whole floor of that nameless hollow, as if the cabin and the old man and the grave itself had been sitting all along on the roof of something enormous, and buried and patient. They filled the grave in without digging further, and they never spoke of it again, in the way of that country, quietly, with their eyes turned away. The ledger says nothing after that. Dr. Silas Hartwell went back down the mountain to a county full of the dying, and the influenza took another year of him before it was through, and he never, as far as anyone knows, told the story aloud to a single living soul. He only wrote it in the back of a book meant for tallying debts, and closed the book, and let it pass into a box, and the box into a century of silence. What he set down there is either the last confession of a lonely old man who had spent a lifetime inside a beautiful and terrible story, or it is a true account of something that stood in this country before us, and was buried and forgotten on purpose, and is standing under the hills yet. The stone under the hollow was never dug up to settle the question. It is still there, if it was ever there at all, holding its courses level and true a foot beneath the roots and the snow, waiting the way it has always waited, for somebody with a spade and the nerve to keep digging past where the others stopped.